We're going to go cover some background information on this book, who wrote it, who the original audience was, and when it was written, and why it might have been written or delivered. Of course, everything that's been written down was probably delivered verbally originally, but then written at some point. So the author, and to get a good sense of Obadiah, the book, we can just dive in with the first verse of the book. The vision of Obadiah. Thus says my Lord Yahweh concerning Edom. Now, so who is the author of the book? Well, at least this is the vision of Obadiah. Whether Obadiah was actually the scribe who committed this to parchment is, a question of history, but we don't have any better author than Obadiah. He's certainly the source of what follows in the book. So Obadiah, but this is an interesting little point. Obadiah may be the one biblical writer or speaker, prophet about whom we have almost no information except his name. In almost every case, the opening of the prophetic book will mention something, Isaiah the son of Amoz, or something about a family name, a connection to a king or some homeland, home city. But here we have nothing but a name, the vision of Obadiah, which means, the name it means is from Eved, and Yahweh, the servant of Yahweh, is what the name means. Or servant is actually maybe a 20th century euphemism for slave, really, because a servant was a slave back in the ancient world. So Eved Yahweh, or Obadiah, is a slave of Yahweh. And he gives us this. And he emphasizes that relationship with Yahweh in the next line when he says, thus says my Lord Yahweh concerning Edom, and he puts that emphasis on the lordship of Yahweh as his master, with him being the servant. So we don't know much about Obadiah, but that he is a servant to Yahweh. And we can infer a little bit about him from what we know in the book. So we can fill in the blank for Obadiah as the author. Who is his audience? Ostensibly, his direct audience would be Edom, and we can see he addresses Edomites directly if as we read through the book. Hopefully you had a chance to read through it before this morning. But probably it's not likely that the Edomites heard Obadiah's words directly themselves. Maybe some did. But what this message is really for are for the people of Judah. So when you talk about, or you see the list of the prophets that were, some were prophets of the northern kingdom of Israel and some were the southern kingdom of Judah, Obadiah will be grouped with those who were prophets to the southern kingdom of Judah because of this, that Edom was adjacent to Judah, not to the northern kingdom. And so he's likely talking to people of Judah about the Edomites and their history. Key to this whole thing is that the descendants of Edom, or the people of Edom, are descendants of Jacob, of Jacob's brother Esau. This book of Obadiah is so short, it's only 21 verses, but it's so dependent on other passages of scripture and coming to Obadiah with that understanding of what the history of Israel is before we get to this point. And we'll hit that in just a minute in more detail. But that relationship between Jacob and Esau becomes mirrored in the relationship between Israel, and specifically Judah, and Edom. This is a map of Edom. And you will see, if you look at the map, the Dead Sea is there north towards the north. Most of the key points of interest that we talk about with regard to Israel, like the city of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Jericho, all of that is going to be north of the Dead Sea. So you can see Edom is at the very southern extent of what would be the territory of Israel, and even south of that. On the map, towards the west side of that double dash line, would be what would be called the Negev, which is a word that just means the south. It's the Negev. It's the south of Israel. And we can see a couple of key points. The city there called Busaira, which I put in there as Basra. Basra is probably not an important town in the time of Christ, but we get the sense, if you look at these biblical texts, including Obadiah and Jeremiah and other older texts from this age, that Basra must have been an important town in their day and age. And Teman, which was originally Ma'an, you can see the Man part of that name in Teman, another important town, noteworthy town in the days of Obadiah, in the days of Jeremiah and those older prophets. One town I'd like to draw your attention to is one that's labeled Petra, or El Biara. Petra is a relatively newer name for this area, but it's one of the most famous towns in Edom of recent times. It's the entrance to the Holy Grail Cave in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Yeah, that's perhaps the most famous rendition of Petra, the treasury. That's what that facade is called, the treasury. Did you know that inside that grand entrance is a small cave that has like 3 rooms off of it, and that's it? It is a tiny place inside. It's all about the outside. It's all about the entrance. The entrance is so grand. It's called the treasury. In fact, that place has been ransacked so often, and historically, it's been the only thing that could possibly hold treasure, based on how it looks, is a little urn that's at the top of the entrance. And that urn has been shot with gunfire as people are trying to break it open and all this. But that urn is actually carved out of solid stone, so it doesn't have an inside. It is a rock that is carved to look like an urn. But people have been defacing and damaging this ancient place looking for money because it's called the treasury. But there's no money there. So that's the audience and the author. Back to the date. We don't know a lot of dates that we can pin to the Edomite country and its actions, but we do have a few things, especially as we get towards the end of the days of Israel. In 845 BC, there was a revolt against Jehoram, recorded in Scripture. And then we know that under the reign of Ahaz, the Edomites took some captives during a raid. And then, of course, Jerusalem falls in 586 BC, and we don't know from any direct narratives what the Edomites' role they might have played during that. We're going to see that they probably played some role because of what Obadiah has to say about them, but we don't know anything specific. But we do know that a few years later, about 30 years later, in 553 BC, Nabonidus of Babylon, a successor to Nebuchadnezzar, also destroyed Edom. And after 553 BC, Edomites as a people group were basically erased off the face of the earth. The people groups that we see there later, in fact, the people who built Petra and the people who did all of those amazing carvings of cities in the mountains, are not Edomites. They're called the Nabateans. It's a completely different ethnic group with unconnected ethnically. Maybe, there could be some descendants of Edomites mixed in with them, but ethnically, the Nabateans who built Petra and those other things are a completely different group. The Edomites as a people disappeared after 553. So we know if Obadiah is addressing Edomites as a group, it's probably going to be before 553. And because of the other circumstances that we see and we infer that Obadiah is referring to the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC, that puts the writing of the book of Obadiah somewhere between those two dates, between 586 and 553. So sometime early in the days of Judah's exile. This is long before the release, where the Judahites can go back and the exile is over. It's long before that. This is going to be an early time during the exile of all the people of Judah. Now, why would Obadiah be called to speak this word against the Edomites? Well, we don't know. Obadiah doesn't tell us that what spurred him to speak the word of the Lord at this point. But there is one possibility that we can consider. It could be a response to the lamentations that were lifted up in Jerusalem during this time. God could be delivering through Obadiah a word of reassurance that the Edomites and the other nations that were around them, that the bad things that were happening to Jerusalem would not go unvindicated, that the people of Judah would once again be vindicated for their faithfulness to Yahweh. Why do I think that could be? Well, in Zechariah chapter 7, verses 4 through 7, we read this. And the word of Yahweh of hosts came to me, saying, say to all the people of the land and to the priests, when you fasted and lamented in the 5th and 7th months of those 70 years, did you really fast for me? And when you eat and drink, are you eating and drinking for yourselves? Are not these the words that Yahweh proclaimed through the former prophets when Jerusalem and its surrounding towns were inhabited and at ease, and the Negev and the Shephelah were inhabited? So in Zechariah, there's a bit of a tone of reprimand that their lamentations haven't always been genuinely focused on Yahweh. But it establishes a context that in Jerusalem, especially during the 5th and 7th months, which were important months during the festival year of the religious calendar, they were fasting and they were raising up lamentations. Maybe not always with the best of motives, but they were doing it. And so the suggestion from one of the commentaries I was reading on Obadiah is that God responded to this lamentation and to the sorrow of the people who were left behind by giving them a message of hope through the words of Obadiah. I think it's reasonable enough to think that that's the occasion that brought us to Obadiah's message. All right, Obadiah. I mentioned how it's so dependent on other things going on in Scripture, and I wanted to just talk about that. Intertextuality is just a fancy word that means that one passage of Scripture depends on another passage of Scripture in order to make perfect sense, that you really can't understand the one you're looking at if you don't understand another one. And that's true for Obadiah. It's very tied to things. Starting back in Genesis, in chapters 25, 27, 28, we start to see that relationship between Jacob and Esau, these two brothers. Obadiah plays off of this Jacob and Esau thing very heavily. And so we see that relationship between those two brothers, how it's rocky at best. I mean, Jacob fled because he thought Esau was going to kill him and was highly nervous about coming back to his home country because he thought Esau might still want to kill him years later. So this was a very tense situation between Jacob and Esau. And that tense situation between two individual people becomes the basis for Obadiah's message to two nations, which were related to those two people. As we look through Obadiah, I think this two-phase picture, a picture of two people, individuals with a difficult relationship, and of two nations with a difficult relationship, becomes a very important thing and helps us in relating to the book, because we may not be able to relate to what Obadiah has to say nation to nation. But we can definitely relate to it if we think about it in terms of person to person.
Huh.
All right, in Numbers, chapter 20, we see another background text to Obadiah. And this is the first point where the nations of Israel and Edom become at odds with each other. Because when Israel is leaving its slavery in Egypt and going through the desert, and finally, by Numbers 20, is ready to turn around and actually go towards the Promised Land after that first aborted attempt to do that, because the people didn't want to go. We see Edom is in between where Israel is and where it wants to go. And Moses asks the Edomites for permission to just pass through their territory, use up some resources, food and water resources, but to pay them back for whatever resources they use as they're passing through the country of Edom. And Edom basically denies them access and says, no, you can't come through here. And Israel has to fight their way through Edom, because Edom won't let them just go through and refuses to cooperate. So here we see the first time when Edom becomes an adversary instead of an advocate for Israel. Something that continues during Israel's time as a nation. In 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 25, we can see some Edomites harassing Solomon with raids along the border. And this tense relationship, we don't see it often, but it comes up every once in a while. It's like there's this constant simmering unease between the Israelites and the Edomites throughout the time of the monarchy. And then in Jeremiah chapter 49, the intertextuality, this dependence on one passage for another, is really just highlighted. Because in verses 7 through 22 of Jeremiah 29, there are passages, phrases that are exactly what Obadiah wrote. We're used to talking about some books like the four Gospels, for example. There are some passages in the four Gospels where it's just clear one of these guys copied the other one, especially the three synoptic Gospels. We know somebody had a text that was exactly like the other guy's text, and one of them took it and copied it and altered it in slight ways to make a different emphasis. There's just no two ways around that. The same thing comes up between 2 Peter and the book of Jude. There are just some passages, some phrases, some comments that are just too similar to be coincidence. The two people had to be working off the same original, or one of them had the other. And that's the case with Jeremiah 49. If you go back and read Jeremiah 49, 7 through 22, and then you read the first 15 verses of Obadiah, you'll come away with the obvious feeling that one of these is depending on the other. They're not totally independent. And we'll see actually some of that work itself out right from the start here as we start looking at the text of Obadiah a little more in detail. All right, so finishing up verse 1. We have heard a report from Yahweh, and the messenger has been sent among the nations. Rise up and let us rise against it for battle. This phrase, this comes almost exactly from Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 13 through 14. In Jeremiah we read, "For I have sworn by myself, declares Yahweh, that Bozrah will become as a horror, as a disgrace, as a waste, as a curse, and all her towns will be everlasting sites of ruins. I have heard a message from Yahweh, and the messenger has been sent out among the nations. Gather and come against her, and rise for battle." Now, if you look at the word for word, it's not exactly word for word. So Obadiah didn't just like copy the text, but he's obviously saying the same thing, especially with that verse. I have heard a message from Yahweh, and messenger has been sent among the nations. Gather and come against her, rise for battle. So what And I feel like because of the timing, Jeremiah was written before Obadiah. So I see this dependency as Obadiah picking up on the message of Jeremiah and then repurposing it for his own message in his prophetic word. And in the context of Jeremiah, we see this message. And I didn't go through the whole context of Jeremiah starting back in verse 9, but Jeremiah is also addressing Edom as a nation. And we can see that Basra is in Edom, so this is continuing that message against Edom overall. And this message about going against her for battle is aimed at the city of Basra specifically. Basra is the target of the battle of this attack that Yahweh is calling for. Now, when Obadiah takes the message from Jeremiah and adapts it for his own purposes, he says, "We have heard a report from Yahweh, and the messenger has been sent among the nations. Rise up and let us rise against it for battle." And what's not obvious in English, because in English we have neuter pronouns like it, which doesn't reveal gender at all. In Hebrew, that it is actually a feminine pronoun. It's still against her. So that is clearly Obadiah picking up on Jeremiah's message, because Obadiah is going to consistently refer to Edom as the brother of Jacob, Esau, the masculine brother of Edom. So if this was not quoting from Jeremiah, it would have been against him, because him is the personification Esau. But he says her and not him. And the reason he uses her is because Jeremiah used her, and Obadiah is quoting Jeremiah. So he quotes Jeremiah's words with that her. Also interesting note that he starts off with, "We have heard a report from Yahweh," not "I have heard a report from Yahweh," which is what Jeremiah said originally. I get the feeling that Obadiah is putting himself amongst the people who heard Jeremiah's message. We, me and everybody else here, heard this message from Yahweh, which came from Jeremiah. He doesn't cite Jeremiah as a source, but I think he means it to be clear by the way he echoes the wording so closely. And so this is Yahweh's desire, that the nations are going to rise up against Edom, Basra specifically, if we understand the context from Jeremiah. And I believe Jeremiah is giving his message before the fall of Jerusalem. He's giving his message prior to that Nebuchadnezzar defeat. And Obadiah is giving his message after it and reflecting on it. So what I think Obadiah is doing here is sort of reminding people that this is kind of what God said would happen all along.
Right.
And he's saying now that it has happened, there are going to be definite consequences for what Edom did and the choices they made at that point. And these kinds of reminders are good because they remind us, as we look back on them, that God was in control over the whole situation. There's nothing that surprised Yahweh in what happened, because he said it was going to happen, and then it happened, and now here's what's going to happen next. All right, so then he continues in Obadiah, "Look, I will make you insignificant among the nations. You'll be utterly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rock, the heights of its dwelling. You who say in your heart, who can bring me down to the ground? Even if you soar like the eagle, even if your nest is set among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares Yahweh." So Edom is going to, get their just desserts for what they did. Obadiah is going to tell us in a little bit what they did, but here he is giving them first the consequences of their actions. he uses this phrase, "You who live in the clefts of the rock, the heights of its dwelling." And here I'm going to indulge in a little bit of anachronism, because this is that treasury of Petra, which is pictured in the Last Crusade, and which is all just entrance. This is just an entrance with nothing behind it but a small cave and a couple of rooms off of it. That's the treasury of Petra, part of the main entrance. The main entrance into Petra is a very narrow cleft in the rock. And when you come down through it, and you see this grand entrance after you get past that passage. And very impressive. But the Edomites didn't build it. The Nabateans built it centuries later. But it is the idea of living among the rocks, of living in the mountains and making your home there. And even though the Edomites didn't make this, carve out the rock to look like this, they did live in these areas. Now, this picture is also a picture of the treasury taken by my grandfather in 1985. My grandparents went on multiple trips to the Holy Lands. On at least one occasion, they went over to Jordan and went to Petra. And so this was a picture from him and that trip. And there's the marketplace back in 1985. Here is a different picture. Petra isn't just the treasury. This is also from their trip. This is a different part of the city. And you can see similar carving there in the wall. And that's how my grandparents got up to Petra, by horse and donkey. That's the primary method of getting there. I think even today is just on horseback, because the paths up in the mountains are impossible to pass with a car. So that's another part of Petra. All right. So here's a further word to the Edomites. All of your allies have driven you to the boundary. Your confederates have deceived you and have prevailed against you. Those who eat your bread have set an ambush for you. There is no understanding of it. On that day, declares Yahweh, will I not destroy the wise men from Edom and understanding from the mountain of Esau? And your warriors will be shattered, O Teman, so that everyone from the mountain of Esau will be cut off because of the slaughter. So it's not going to be good for Edom. And we actually see this fulfilled with Nabonidus and the Babylonians wiping out the Edomites a little bit after the fall of Jerusalem, 30 years after that. But the note of Edom getting betrayed by their allies and by the people who would eat their bread and share their bread together. It's kind of a fitting end, because Edom ought to have been an ally to Israel, because Esau was Jacob's brother. Edom was, in a sense, the brother of Israel. But Edom didn't act like a brother. Edom didn't act like an ally when the Babylonians came. It acted like an enemy. So it's fitting irony that Edom would also be destroyed by people they thought were their allies and their friends. And it's going to be worse for Edom than for Israel, because Israel at least still maintains their national identity. There is still an Israel, but there will not be an Edom when all is said and done. I'm just going to summarize verses 10 through 14. It's some of the most fiery language of this prophecy, but it does get a little repetitive in some spots, and I just want to, in the interest of time, since I'm already at 10:46, just kind of summarize here what Esau did when Jacob suffered, because this is very personal wording here. And not what one nation did to another, but what one person did to another is how it's phrased. Edom stood by and did nothing to help, gloated over the misfortune of Israel, of Jacob, laughed at his distress, took advantage for personal gain, and made things worse by helping the enemy. If they had just stood by and did nothing to help, that would have been bad enough. But by the end of this tirade, we see that Edomites actually made things worse by killing Israelites themselves, helping the Babylonians to wipe out people who had escaped from Israel. They got away from Israel, but as they fled Jerusalem and were fleeing into the southern country, the Edomites killed those who had escaped. So the Edomites just made things worse. They didn't stop Babylon from advancing on Israel, and they had to have gone through. There's a bit of that irony there, back to Numbers chapter 20. Edom wouldn't let the Israelites through when they were trying to get to their promised land, but they did let the Babylonians through when they were trying to get to the promised land to destroy Israel. So the Edomites just weren't behaving like a brother, like a friend to Israel in all of this, but they should have been that whole time. And one thing I want us to think about as a practical application of Obadiah is how we treat our enemies or people against whom we have a rivalry. I think Obadiah is the kind of reversal of Jesus' teaching that you are to love your enemies. Because here, Edom didn't even love their friend, their brother. They were acting like the opposite of that. Whereas Jesus calls us to love even our enemies, and not act like this towards anyone, friend or enemy. And the kicker for me, as I was thinking about this, is the fall of Jerusalem was actually justice. Yahweh was delivering justice against Jerusalem by having Babylon destroy it. The exile was his idea. He was putting the Israelites in Jerusalem to punishment for their faithlessness. But Esau, Edom, was supposed to love their brother anyway, even though it was a day of justice and against Jerusalem. Edom was not supposed to come in and treat Jerusalem badly just because Jerusalem was getting what it deserved. They were supposed to love them. That to me is the greatest challenge, because sometimes if we see somebody against whom we've had issues, people who've made our lives difficult or hard, and we see them suffering and we know they deserve it, I think we tend to go to that gloating thing. Twice in the list of things that Edom gets called out for is gloating over his brother for his pain and suffering. I may not, kill people who escape the suffering or do whatever extreme things, but gloating, I think that's in my list of things I do. When I see somebody who I think deserves it, getting what they deserve. All right. Well, the last part of Obadiah switches, and we'll just spend a couple of minutes on this. It switches from specifically focused on Edom to judgment that God is going to pour out on all the nations, because Edom becomes a kind of symbol for all the nations who have been opposing Israel, who are opposing God and rebelling against him. And the day of judgment isn't just going to come out for Jerusalem and the Israelites. It isn't just going to come on Edom. It's going to come out for all the nations. All the nations are going to eventually have justice poured out on them for their actions and lack of love. And this might be the theme of the whole book, Just as you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return on your own head. And if that doesn't sound like a variation on Jesus' own teaching, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It basically is do unto others because eventually they're going to do the same to you. Do unto others the way you want to be treated, because you will be treated eventually the same way that you treat others. So you want your deeds to come back nice. So if you want nice things done to you, do nice things to others. God will find justice out and mete justice out to all eventually. And interesting, in verse 16, he says, for just as you, and here it seems that the you is the actual Israelites, not the Edomites, just as you have drunk on my holy mountain, all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and they will slurp and they will be as if they had never been. This idea of drinking, what are they having? Are they having like some sweet tea? Judgment. And this idea that what they drink is judgment. Look at Psalm 75. This is, of course, before Obadiah. There is a cup in the hand of Yahweh with wine that foams, full mixed, and he pours it out from this. Surely all the wicked of the land will quaff it down to its dregs. Wine is supposed to be a pleasant thing to drink. It's supposed to be a celebration thing or a pleasant thing. But the wine that's in this cup is definitely not in that category. It is not wine you want to drink. And this picture, talk about intertextuality, how Obadiah kind of picks up on things. This drinking the wine from God's cup is one of these things that is before Obadiah, and Obadiah picks up on and puts part of his message. But then after Obadiah, this picture continues. Look at Revelation chapter 14, verses 9 through 10. And another third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast in his image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he himself will also drink the wine of the anger of God that has been mixed full strength in the cup of wrath, and will be tortured with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. You do not want to drink this wine. Don't want to. But God is going to pour it out on those who are not faithful to him. But those who have been saved, skipping to the end of Obadiah so we can wrap it up, those who have been saved will go up on Mount Zion and rule the kingdom of Esau, and the kingdom will belong to Yahweh. So the people of Israel will escape. Basically, they've already had their punishment, and now all the other nations are going to have theirs. The people who are saved are going to go up on Mount Zion and rule over Esau. Although this picture might be just of Israel being vindicated against Edom, we see this imagery being applied in our Christian era as well. In Hebrews chapter 12, we read, but you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, to the heavenly Jerusalem, to the tens of thousands of angels and the festal gathering and assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of righteous people made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant. And so we see that this vindication in Obadiah has application even now, that we who are faithful to Christ will be those who go up on Mount Zion and who are with him in that, and we will escape the wrath that's being poured out on all the nations because we will be with him, with Christ on Zion.